Okay, I know this is going to rub a lot of Fallout fans the wrong way, but there are a number of hard, inescapable truths about being a Fallout fan that aren't always convenient or pleasant. Fallout 4's story dissolves into a hot mess in late game. Fallout 3's departure from established lore and cultural identities of recurring factions led to a whole movement of Fallout fans who refuse to acknowledge Bethesda as the bearer of the canon. Those sorts of hard truths. Then take Fallout New Vegas. It's probably the most well-rounded Fallout game of all. Its combat and gameplay mechanics, while based on Fallout 3, constituted an improvement over its predecessor in almost every way. Although it reused a lot of assets from Fallout 3 and takes place in a freaking desert, the world that was created still somehow feels more lived in, more organic, and more vibrant than anything we saw in Fallout 3. And some will argue even in Fallout 4 that came out 5 years later. And the story is by far the best of the 3D generation games, though you'll still find some sticklers that will argue that Fallouts 1 and 2 are better stories overall. But many fans will just never know for sure, since the accessibility of Bethesda-era Fallout gameplay has basically spoiled us to the point that many of us just can't stand the originals long enough to even make it through the tutorial levels. But all of these things, coalesced in the form of Fallout New Vegas, gave birth to a whole subculture among Fallout fans. The cult of Obsidian. You can't escape them, like evangelizing missionaries pounding on your door when you just want to zone out and build another settlement that will inevitably need your help. They pop up everywhere we go to talk about Fallout: Reddit, Steam forums, Discord, and yes, YouTube comment sections, spreading the gospel of Obsidian. Obsidian can do no wrong, and should be the only developer who is allowed to make Fallout games ever again. At the very least, you get those middle-of-the-roaders who wish Bethesda would at least contract with them between main title releases so we can at least get more than one Fallout game every decade. But that wish, let's face it, and that's what it is, just a harmless wish, just a poker chip tossed into a fountain, is based on a number of logical fallacies that I think need to be addressed by the Fallout community at large. Hopefully you're stocked up on Xander root and Brock flower so you can whip up some healing powder as I minister around the campfire, because I'm Gray, you're watching Gray Gaming, and this is my case against the cult of Obsidian. To begin, we need to go all the way back to the beginning of Obsidian's legend, the story of Knights of the Old Republic 2. You see, in a tale that should sound very familiar to Fallout fans, BioWare had made a great game in the form of Knights of the Old Republic. Back in those days, studios had this weird business practice where they released a game after it was finished. You didn't just release a half-finished version and then sell the missing pieces as DLC, so once it was out, the team just had to move on to the next big thing, so they had something else to bring in the next crop of royalty checks for the company to live off of until yet another game was finished. It was a vicious, uncertain cycle that sadly modern developers are just too risk-averse to handle anymore. But anyway, back to BioWare. So by the time they realized there was a ton of demand for a sequel to KOTOR, they had already allocated most of the creative minds behind KOTOR to another project, which would thankfully one day become Mass Effect. So BioWare contracted with the then unknown Obsidian, gave them a license, gave them the engine, all the assets, and gave them a firm deadline and told them, make us a sequel. Obsidian, a brand new studio and strapped for cash, was only too happy to oblige. They tasked Chris Avellone with making it happen. Avellone, much like many folks at Obsidian at the time, were coming from the now defunct Black Isle Studios / Interplay, who also happened to be the original developers and owners of Fallout. Avellone, for his part, had been tasked with finishing Fallout 2 after the original creator of Fallout, Tim Kaine, left the company prior to project completion. Now, I'm not going to get super deep into development hell because a lot of it is hearsay, rumor, and I just personally don't find all of it that interesting. But when KOTOR released, it was pretty clear that this game was a mess. When I bought it back in the mid-2000s, it literally couldn't install on the computer I was running at the time because the installer kept crashing around the third of 4 CDs you needed to insert to install the game. And for those who could get it to run, it was buggy as moist bantha fodder. It was very clear that huge sections of this game were cut, leaving some levels woefully underdeveloped and barren. Now, thankfully, modders eventually did their best to restore some of this cut content and released unofficial patches that made the game somewhat stable, but but KOTOR 2, for all its flaws, was an incredible piece of storytelling, somehow building a wider story that in no way relied on the first game to prop it up, while still incorporating just enough that both games were clearly part of the same universe, telling a continuum of tales that strengthened the stories of each. Chris Avellone apparently learned a lesson or two from being forced to complete someone else's story when he rescued Fallout 2 from the scrap heap before someone could make a crappy couch or something out of it. Now fast forward about 4 or 5 years and Bethesda bursts onto the scene. They've been in the RPG game for decades with the Elder Scrolls, and after purchasing all the rights to Fallout, they've released their first Fallout game in the form of Fallout 3. Now some diehard fans of the original games absolutely hate it, but it attracted enough new fans to the franchise that our buddy boy Todd sees it as the cash cow that it is. But he's already got his team working on Skyrim. He wouldn't be able to exploit the Fallout franchise for close to a decade, so he went to the studio that seems to have a knack for writing brilliant if buggy sequels to other studios' IPs, and what the hell does he care about bugs? He makes Bethesda games for a living. So the story of Fallout New Vegas proceeds almost identically to how it did in KOTOR 2. Obsidian tasks Chris Avellone to do the writing. Josh Sawyer, another Fallout alumnus from Black Isle, is also brought in to lead the project, and their team is handed the engine to Fallout 3 along with all its assets and told to get it done by this date or else, and that timeline was knuckin' futz. Somehow I have no idea how they realized a somewhat playable game. As one might expect, there were still some pretty big chunks of the game that were cut or left unfinished, so pretty much the entire map north of Vegas, other than the Boomers compound, were left completely unfinished with pretty much no reason to go there and explore. The game was also horrifically buggy, with its crashes and glitches becoming almost more legendary than its incredible storytelling and freedom of player choice. The game was eventually stabilized to the point that it's playable even today after several hardware generations have passed, but there's more than one rad gremlin still rearing its ugly head from time to time. But like I said, it was the story, the world building, the whole aesthetic and charisma that seems to ooze from every datedly rendered NPC and low poly object. People like to compare the dated graphics of Fallout New Vegas at the time to Skyrim that released 13 months later after Fallout New Vegas, but hell, look at The Witcher 2, only the second game that CD Projekt Red had ever produced that came out 7 months after New Vegas, that gives you a much better idea of just how behind the times this game was technically, but it's all been forgiven in the name of superb writing and storytelling. Now this is where most in the cult of Obsidian choose to end their Bible. Anything that came after October 2010 is heresy. The Gospel of New Vegas is all the proof one needs to belittle Bethesda as a studio, Todd Howard as a game director, Emil Pagliarulo as a writer. But to those of us that study history, we know there's another piece of this tale that often gets overlooked. The year is 2019, nearly a decade after the release of Fallout New Vegas. Obsidian has just released a new first-person single-player RPG, and the similarities between it and Fallout New Vegas cannot be ignored. This game is called The Outer Worlds, and it is a brand new IP wholly owned by Obsidian. This time, they aren't beholden to some other developer into using their game engine, reusing their assets, and being forced into a rushed development cycle that all but ensures an unfinished product. They aren't hamstringed into trying to write what is essentially fanfiction for someone else's IP that will spark years of debate over whether it's canon or not. No, The Outer Worlds is Obsidian's oyster, a world of their own creation, a story of their own telling, and who did they get to ensure this game became a reality? Only Tim freaking Kaine, the father of Fallout, and he even brought along Leonard Boyarsky, the original artist for Fallout. If there was ever a winning formula for a role-playing game developed in the late 2010s, arguably the last gasp of great game development history, it was this team, backed by the studio responsible for two of the most beloved RPGs of the 21st century. Now, I won't spoil The Outer Worlds for you, but if you are interested, I did a 40-minute deep dive over on Great Galaxies. I'll link at the end of this video if you care to check it out. But essentially, The Outer Worlds is just underwhelming in almost every way. The combat is basically a copy and paste from Fallout New Vegas, which was fine for its own time given the tech that they were working with, but almost a full decade later, it was really showing its age. The story draws you in with intrigue, ambiguity, hard moral choices, and then just devolves into continuity errors, plot holes, and a hastily cobbled together endgame that struck out of nowhere. I checked my gameplay footage. The final act from point of no return to epilogue lasted a total of 22 minutes. Seriously, that's all you had to cap off this absolute hype monster of a game? A silver lining is that the game is stable, at least here in 2025. I honestly wasn't paying close enough attention at launch to hear much, but from what I gathered, people were far more interested in talking about the gameplay and its similarity to Fallout than any technical issues, so I have to imagine that it constituted a pretty major departure from previous Obsidian RPGs. For my part, I've only experienced a single crash during a complete playthrough, and other than some hitbox and collision issues from time to time, this game ran like a poorly optimized tank on my system. I know, sample size of 1, I'm generalizing and I get it, but let me know how it ran for you. But as is tradition for Obsidian at this point, there were some sections of this game that were undeniably unfinished, whether it's the planets on the solar system map that you're never allowed to go to because they were just never finished, or large swathes of abandoned villages where every door is boarded up and there are no occupants, or in the case of one asteroid, an entire village that was definitely intended to be home for a large section of the game, but was just left empty save for one internal cell that can only be accessed during a companion questline and some random robot just mining away without supervision. And just in case you were hoping that the companions were even close to the same level of emotional and moral complexity as those found in Fallout New Vegas or KOTOR 2, guess again. At the best of times, they're pretty on par with Fallout 4's average tier companions. At worst of times, basically any Fallout 3 companion. The Outer Worlds should have been Obsidian's magnum opus, a studio with 2 decades of experience under its belt, a proven track record of keeping other studios' IPs afloat, and a team of highly skilled, one might even say legendary individuals in the industry holding the reins. But even with all that and literally all the time in the world and full creative freedom, the best they were able to pull off was fairly average, some could even argue mediocre. So all this leads me to my thesis that Obsidian should not be the only studio allowed to make Fallout games. The Outer Worlds had the godfather of Fallout himself, Tim Kaine, in the captain's chair, but he wasn't writing the story. Instead, Leonard Boyarsky was narrative director, where on Fallout he had been lead artist. Neither was positioned to bring fans what they were hoping for. Josh Sawyer, project director behind New Vegas, had been tasked elsewhere on another project, so he had nothing to do with this one, and it shows. Chris Avallone, the writer of Fallout New Vegas and incidentally Fallout 2, had left Obsidian at this point, so the genius of story writing, at least when working within the bounds of established universes, that had built Obsidian's reputation was no longer an asset that could be depended on to give fans everything they were hoping for and more. And now Tim Kaine, the architect himself, has also left Obsidian. He's still contracting with them to finish the Outer Worlds, but other than that, he's just doing the independent contractor and consulting gig with a YouTube channel on the side. Obsidian, for a tiny, exceptionally brief window, did have the Fallout Dream Team working for them: Avallone, Sawyer, Boyarsky, and Kaine. If they could have somehow been excused from their existing workloads or allowed some downtime to focus on a Fallout side project between 2011 and 2015 when they were all together at the same studio, sure, they could have probably given us something incredible. But here today, Josh Sawyer is the only one still left at Obsidian, and while yes, he could probably do a great job as project director, it takes more to make a game happen than a competent project manager. You need writers, artists, and creative people of every flavor with a passion for the project that they're working on and a deep respect for the source material. It saddens me to think about what we could have gotten if Sawyer had been tasked to direct a game where Chris Avallone did the writing, Tim Kaine led design, and Leonard Boyarsky did the asset design, and throw in a contract gig for Inon Zur just so that we can have some consistency with the soundtracks. It could have been absolutely incredible, but those days are long since past. Obsidian to this day remains a company best known for either buggy, unstable masterpieces written by people who no longer work for them, or competent, if uninspired, technical works hampered by shoddy writing from people who no longer work for them. The cult of Obsidian, Fallout, or whatever I chose to call them at the start of this video, simply don't seem to understand this. To them, game studios like Bethesda or Obsidian are just amorphous entities, not made up of individuals with their own strengths and weaknesses, flaws and imperfections. They think studios are never changing, never evolving. They're a singular figure that has remained constant, without growth, and immune to withering. It's the same sort of mindset that had people thinking that after releasing a total of 3 games, all revolving around the same characters and the same IP, CD Projekt Red was going to knock it out of the park with Cyberpunk 2077. It's the same sort of people people that thought that after years of EA screwing up anything it touched that Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order was going to suck, and it's a banger. Yeah, I know Respawn did all the development, but don't forget EA hogs all the press. Now, it hurts to think about, and I've probably just dropped big horner nuggets all over your dreams of Obsidian someday wrestling control of Fallout away from Todd's filthy skooma-stained hands and releasing Fallout games that we can once again be proud to play. But I think it's time for this cult to do a bit of deprogramming and join the Fallout community at large who are waiting to welcome you with open arms. We still love New Vegas, and we'll cherish the time we got with it. We'll mod in our own remaster of it into Fallout 4 and write crappy fanfics on our YouTube channels. But we won't waste our time hoping for something that is never going to happen, and even if we got our wish, we know it will never live up to our expectations. But most importantly, we will get on with our lives, because that's what Fallout New Vegas would have wanted us to do. And it is the least we can do for something that has brought us so much joy for so many years. Okie dokie, on a less somber and somehow more serious note, I wanted to take a minute to salute my patrons over at Patreon who keep me making silly content like this. Welcome to David, who joins the ranks as a non-commissioned officer. Special thanks to my officers Josh B and Carver050, and continued thanks to all my non-coms who keep those dang grunts out of the jelly donuts. You know what happens when the non-coms find you with a jelly donut. Until my next salute, stand at ease. Thank you so much for watching to the end, stay safe, and I hope to see you here next time on Gray Gaming.